All right, we're going to work at the sewing machine for this sew along, and we've got the handy dandy Teddy designer top from Style Art Patterns, and these are our instructions. Kind of skimpy, but we're going to go with these. I measured the width of the pattern and decided what I wanted for my finished garment measurements and cut out based on that. Since they don't really give you a lot of information on here, you have to determine that yourself. So I laid the front and back pieces and I measured them, and there is a stitching line on there, so I measured them from stitching line to stitching line, front and back, and then determined how much ease I wanted based on my bust measurements and cut out according to that. So I actually added 4 inches. This crepe that I'm using is got a teeny tiny bit of stretch, not much, and I want this pattern to kind of lay comfortably. So we are going to start. It says cut out the pattern, grain lines. We did that. We interfaced. I used a tricot stretch interfacing on here, lightweight. I interfaced the neck pieces and also the collar, one side of the collar. And then 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance and 1/4 inch on internal seams, and that would be the collar, the neck edge, that type of seam. And the most difficult part of sewing this top is sewing the lower collar insert to the center front to attain a lovely V-shaped neck. So this front piece is 2 pieces. It's not cut on the fold, and that's the first step in getting a really crisp V-neck. With this one, we have the added challenge of putting on a collar to it. Cut the fabric and fuse the noted pieces. We suggest a lightweight fuse on this style, and it will allow the collar to turn down or stand up and hug the neck, whichever you prefer. All right, construction. We have 13 steps on here, and we have a few photos, not many, just a few. So we're going to go through this step by step. With right sides together, pin outer edges of collar together. Turn out to the right side, press, and sew a stay stitch around the outer edges of the collar to hold in place. Be careful not to stretch this edge. Note when wearing this garment, the collar can be turned over or left up to hug the neck. Therefore, the flat stitch is not used as it will show. Carefully press and put aside. Okay, with right sides together, so we're going to repeat this. With right sides together, pin the outer edge of the collar. All right, so I have my interfaced collar piece, and I have my non-interfaced collar piece. I'm going to sew these right sides together along the outside edge. So this is the collar. Let's see what it says on here. So yeah, it doesn't even tell you which side on the pattern piece is the outside edge, but think about this. This is the collar going down, right? It's going to look like that. So we know that this is the outside edge. This obviously wouldn't sew into our garment. So we're going to pin the outside edge and we're going to stitch it with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And I like to pin, you know, you can pin at critical junctures here. I pinned at the end. I'm going to pin at each of these corners where the collar turns. This is kind of a soft turning collar, but I am going to sew at this juncture. I'm going to sew off and sew back on again and get a little bit of a crisper seam. If you pivot, there's a chance that your stitch will come out. It won't turn quite as nicely. So I'm going to 3/8 of an inch stitch all the way off here, and then I'm going to come back and 3/8 of an inch stitch down that way. All right, when starting a piece like this edge is pretty thin. So I'm going to start in here, in from the edge of the fabric, and then back stitch out and forward stitch, and that will help me from getting the fabric jammed down into my throat plate, which we don't want. So 3/8 of an inch on my machine. I'm going to take a stitch forward, and then I'm going to back stitch, and that gives it some stability, and then I'm going to go ahead and stitch. And as I come up to this edge here, this soft corner, I'm going to stitch off. I don't need to back stitch, it's fine. Pull my petal closer. And then I'm going to put my fabric back in, and I'm going to go across the top. So again, as I get to this corner, I'm going to sew off. And then place this back in the machine. Now this collar is cut on the bias a little bit, so it moves. One of the things that I want to do before I clean up those edges and serge them is just make sure that it's balanced and even the way it's stitched. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm pretty happy with that. And I don't know if you can see, let's see, can you see? But I've sewn off and then gotten back on and sewn on again, and that's going to give me a better corner. So I'm going to go ahead and serge these edges just to neaten them up, because I prefer my edges serged and clean. All right, we stitched that seam. I serged it. We folded the wrong sides together. We have a pretty decent little corner here. It's soft because of the angle. And when you turn the corner in, you want to fold down one side along the seam and fold down the other side along the seam. And in this case, you have a soft corner. And what you're going to do is stick your fingers between the two pieces of fabric and grab that. And that will give you a beautiful corner. So we've done that, and then go back and measure again just to make sure that the length is the same, and then the length from here to the end is the same, right? That's important, that the collar is balanced. If it isn't, then you need to reconstruct or restitch. And now we're just going to stay stitched this edge closed, which is, I would do it, right on the edge. We're just going to stay stitch that closed so it's actually functioning as one piece. Now this doesn't call for understitching because they said the collar could stand up or lay down. It also doesn't call for top stitching. Both of those you could do. If you prefer the collar to lay down, then you could put a row of understitching under there. That's totally up to you. That's a design call. But right now we're just going to pin it because I don't want it to roll. And then I'm going to stay stitch the bottom edge so it doesn't get out of shape. I stay stitched that edge closed, and I did it at about a 1/4 inch, because I don't want to have to take it out after I sew the collar on. So if it's 3/8 of an inch, and it's too far in or too far out, then you're going to have to rip it out, because it's going to be a problem. So I'm just trimming. I have some excess interfacing floating along the bottom here. So I'm just trimming that away because it's annoying me. There we go. All right, our collar is all set and ready to go. That looks really pretty. And we're going to set that aside and move on to the next step. Step 2, cuffs. With right sides facing, sew the 2 short ends of the cuffs together. Turn out the right sides and press in half. Sew a stay stitch on the 2 raw edges to hold in place, as the cuffs are on the bias and can be stretchy. So put cuffs aside. All right, so here are our cuffs. Put this pattern piece aside. And we're going to sew the ends right sides together. So these are these 2 pointy ends. And we're going to do both cuffs. And again, just like we did with the collar, we're going to sew up to this mark and sew off, and then get back on again. So we're going to start with the mark there in the center, because we want to make sure that the center is centered. We're going to do both of them. Again, right sides together. Match up in the center mark, and then the edges. So that gives me, I sewed up here and then sewed up here, and then I'm going to turn these so they're right sides together and they form a loop. I'm going to press this, obviously, press this to one side. But what we're going to do is turn them on themselves, so we have a cuff that looks like that. And then, just like we did with the collar, we're going to stay stitch this together to make sure that we have one unit. It just makes it much easier. It keeps it from stretching, and it makes it much easier to apply when it's actually all together as one piece. All right, so we're going to finish up the cuffs. All right, here are our bands all the way around. We have 2 of them, armbands, ready to go. So we're going to set those aside with our collar. Step 3, facings. Sew together the shoulder seams of the neck facings, followed by sewing the center front seam. Press seams open and put aside. Okay, so we have our back facing. This side here. And we don't put that pattern piece anymore. And our front neck facings. And again, I like to lay things out so I can see how they're going to go, so I know. So that's my facing. So I'm going to sew the shoulder seams here, and then I'm going to sew this front seam together. So I'll have a full neck facing. All right, here is our beautiful neck facing. We have our shoulders, and then it's sewn down the bottom. I pressed the seams at the shoulders to the front, because on the garment I'm going to press them to the back. But on the center front piece, I opened them, and I'm going to open the center front seam on the garment too, because there's a lot of fabric there. And also, if you can see through, if somehow light shining through this, I don't want a ridge on one side or the other of my garment. So I'm going to set this aside with everything else. Step 4, with right sides together, sew the side seams of the front and back hem facings. All right, hem facings. So these are cut on the fold. All right, so we have the tunic. I'm making the tunic, so we have the tunic front hem facing and the tunic back hem facing. and we are going to sew these right sides together. So think about this is going to be, again, like the other facing, it's going to be a big circle. So we're going to sew this here because it's going to encase the whole hem. Right, so it's going to end up looking like this. Right, that's how we want it to go together. So we want this big, nice big circle. So we're going to sew these together at the ends. That's a quick deal. And set them aside. Be careful you don't twist them. That would be unfortunate if you twisted them. You know, I always lay everything out in front of me, even now while I'm sewing. It's very easy to twist something, and we want to avoid that at all costs. All right, here are my hem facings, and I'm going to press these seams towards the front because the seams on my garment will be pressed to the back, and then that way they can butt up against each other. So we set that aside. Step 5, body. Sew the front and back shoulder seams together. All right. We are going to sew the shoulder seams. So I'm going to start with laying the back piece down on my table, right sides up. So here is my neck edge, right, and my really long shoulder. And then I'm going to take my front, and I know that this goes this way. I like to lay my pieces out, right? So this is going to go this way because this is my neck edge. I'm going to lay this one out also, and this is my neck edge. You can see that that is also my neck edge, so it's going to come together like that. Right, so here's the neck edge. So these are the shoulder seams. They're really long because they have these kind of grown on sleeves. So I know this is right, so I can turn these pieces right sides together. And I'm going to pin this shoulder seam. I'm going to start at the neck edge. I'm going to pin that. And then I'm going to pin where the arm hole is. And I might throw another pin in there just because it's a little stretchy. Actually, I might throw 2 in there. Just so I know it's not going to go anywhere. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this shoulder seam. Make sure you don't sew the neck edge to the shoulder seam. That would be bad. Or the armhole to the shoulder seam. And you would have to rip it out, and that would not be fun. No one likes to do that. I have a little nubby here on my neck edge. Scissors missed. All right, so you know, if they don't match up perfectly, then something's wrong. Either you're pinning the wrong pieces together or you cut them out incorrectly, because they should match up beautifully. So here we can see this is the front. This is the way the front is going to go together. This is the front neck edge, and then this is the back neck. So I'm going to sew these shoulder seams together, and then I'm going to press them to the back. We have sewn our shoulder seams together, and I serged them and pressed them towards the back. Let's see, we are on step 6. Sew a stay stitch, it's hard to say. Sew a stay stitch around the neckline as the neckline is on the bias, and it will need to be stabilized. Absolutely, that is a great step. So it's just a single layer all the way around the neckline, starting in the front at this little nub and go all the way around 1/4 of an inch. Make sure that your fabric is sitting on a bed, so when you're doing this stay stitching and even your regular stitching, the fabric isn't hanging off the table. You want to make sure that it's all up so there's no pull on it, creating a stretch. Step 7, pin the collar to the neckline. It is most important to match the notches. The base of the collar is to fit at the notch on the center front seam. All right, it says see collar diagram. So we're going to pin this collar on to the front side of our garment. We haven't sewn up the front seam yet. So we're going to take our collar that's been set aside. And we're going to find the center back seam of the collar. We're going to fold the collar in half and find the center back seam of the collar. I like to start there. And we're going to match up the shoulder seams on the garment and put a pin in the center back neck seam. And that's where we're going to start. And we know now, if nothing else, our collar is balanced and equal. Now, so we match up these two pins that we measured for the center back seams. And then this collar piece is going to, this crepe is very slippery. This collar piece is going to come into that notch there. Okay. Right there at the edge of the notch. So we're going to pin that down. And then we are going to fit this collar as we go around the neckline. And sometimes this takes a little bit of fiddle work because you have a curved seam and you want to make sure that your seam is balanced. Now that fits together beautifully, and if it doesn't, you've probably pinned something incorrectly. So you're going to go back and do the other side, same thing. We're going to match this edge of the collar to the notch in the front, and we're going to pin all the way around. I like to start from the neck. Look at how beautifully that fits together. Right? There are times when you can get away with not pinning, but there are times when you absolutely have to pin. So if I lay this down, I fold it at the shoulder seams. You can see I have this very pretty shawl collar, right? Pinned down. All right, so we've pinned it. We're supposed to stitch it. Pin the collar to the neckline. All right, sew the center front seam. Pin the collar to the neckline. It is most important to match the notches. The base of the collar is to finish at the notch at the center front seam. Sew the center front seam up to the notch. Press the seam open, then sew the front back side seams together. All right, this does not say to stitch the collar. So we've pinned our collar, and we're going to reread section 7 again. Pin the collar to the neckline. We've done that. It is most important to match the notches. The base of the collar is to finish at the notch for the center front seam. That's right there. Right? So we know that they're balanced. And then it says see collar diagram. I am going to stitch this down. It does not tell you to do that. But before I sew up this center seam, I don't want to deal with all these pins. I don't want to deal with this shifting. So I'm going to stitch this down at 1/4 of an inch, a very scant 1/4 of an inch, just so it becomes part of my garment. Step 8, sew the center front seam up to the notch, press open, then sew the front and back side seams together. All right, so I've stitched on my collar because now it's one unit. And I'm going to sew my center front seam, which is where that notch is, and then my side seams. And this seam I'm going to press open just like I pressed open the facing, because it gives me less bulk when I'm trying to attach them all together. So I'll be back when my garment's all sewed up. All right, we are on step 9. I have my neck facing interfaced, sewn together, and I've serged the edges. It has a nice stretch interfacing on it. And step 9 says, with right sides together, pin the neck facing to the neckline, sandwiching the collar in between. Take care at the center front seam where it joins the collar ends. So we have our top, which is askew at the moment. All right. Here's our top with our nice collar on it. And now we are going to pin the facing to the collar. And since we moved the shoulder seams to the back of the garment, we're going to move the facing seams to the right of the garment, and that gives us a better opportunity to sandwich the garments together and have not have a lot of bulk. So you can actually just kind of push those with your fingers and you can feel it. And I'm going to pin this all the way around and then stitch. So we'll be back. So we're coming along the facing, sewing the neck edge, and I started at the shoulder seam because I wanted to be able to get down to this V down here in the front without having to be my start and stop point. So we're sewing a 3/8 inch seam, and you want to make sure everything is flat. It really helps when your machine has a down needle stop position for something like this, because there's a lot of kind of futzing. So we're going to navigate to that V. And the trick with this collar is to make sure that it's balanced on both sides. So we have to be very careful. I might be a little shallow here on my stitches, but that's okay. I will, if I have to go back and fix them, I will. So I'm right in the crotch of that seam, and I'm going to pivot. And we won't know how it looks until we take it out, but we have the opportunity to go back and fix it if we have to. So the pattern fits together really well. There isn't a lot of futzing you have to do to get it to go together, so that's a plus. Now we're going to look and see how we did. Right, this, I'm going to go all the way around and check my seams, make sure there's no puckers, pleats. Right, and then we get to the front and we're going to see if this is balanced before we start trimming and cutting. So there's all this extra stuff in there, but what I really want to make sure is that the edges of my collar are equidistant from this center seam, and it looks like they are. So here's the collar here, and here's my collar here. So you need them to be balanced from this center seam. That's really what is going to make this look right. So we're going to put a snip in this to the seam, but not through, and then that will release some of this tension. Second one in. All right, that releases the tension. So here's my collar on this side. I'm just going to put a pin in it because I want to make sure before I finish my facing that this is all the way I want it to be, that it all looks I'm happy with the way that it looks. And so I've pinned this down this way. There's a lot of bulk in there, and we're going to take care of that with the serger and some clipping and some stay stitching. But right now, we just want, before we do all of that, we want to make sure that the collar is even on both sides, right? So here's my center seam, and they look like they start in exactly the same place on either side. There's the beginning of the collar right there. All right, so we have to take care of all of this. This is a mess, but I just want to make sure that this start is the same from the seam. So I think we're good there. So now we're going to take care of the facing. There's a couple of things we need to do. The first thing we need to do is to serge it. So I'm going to take it to the serger, and I'm going to serge this, and then I'm going to clip it, and then we're going to stitch it. We're going to stay stitch it. No, I'm sorry. Then we're going to understitch it to the facing, so that will help it roll over. So we're going to make it nice and pretty. So I'm going to go do that now. Serging, then some clipping to make sure that it gives the opportunity to open up. I'll come back when I go to do the clipping and the stay stitching, and I'll show you exactly how that works. Now I've gone ahead and serged all around my neckline and pressed my facing and the seam allowance in the same direction in the back, and push the collar down, because what I want to do is I want to stitch the facing and the seam allowance together, and that will help me get a better roll. When I got to the center front, there is some clipping you need to do, and actually one of my collar pieces was a little bit further away than the other one, so I just went back and stitched this a little closer. I went in and just added another little row of stitching in there just to bring the collar closer together, so now that they look balanced, which is really important. And you need to do some decent snipping inside here to get this to release. So the goal of snipping the seam allowance lets the fabric move. So whenever you have a curve, you will get a much flatter seam if you put little clips into it. So we have this big angle here in the front, so we're going to clip that, and you want to clip to the seam but not through. And I'm just going to take a little bit of this bulk away, just a smidge, not much. And then this piece going along the neckline is fine, but around the back of the neckline you have a curve. You have this really pretty curve, so I'm just going to snip into that a little bit. And what that does is it allows the fabric, it gives the fabric a place to go when we turn it around. Just be careful you don't snip your blouse. Work too hard on it to snip through it. Right now I want to do some understitching. So I'm going to stitch it this way with the seam allowance up. The facing is going to be to my right, and the collar and the shirt are going to go away, because essentially I'm just sewing this seam allowance to the facing. That's all I want to do. I want to connect the two of them, and I want to do it fairly close to my original seam allowance. So be very careful during this step that you don't catch your collar inside the stitching. So there is my row of understitching. It's attaching the facing and the seam allowance together. And what that does is it makes this very pretty roll so much easier. I mean, before I've even pressed that, look at how much nicer that looks just from doing the understitching. Now it's going to be a little messy in the front because we've done an awful lot of clipping here. But still, it looks nice. So I'm going to go all the way around and check it. Now you have the option to stitch underneath the collar, and that will also help hold the facing down because you're not going to see the collar unless you plan on wearing the collar up. If you plan on wearing the collar up, which they show in one of the pictures. So if you look at this picture here, her collar is up, right? Or you can turn the collar and fold it down. So if you're going to wear the collar up, don't understitch underneath the collar because then you'll see it. What I'm going to do is give this a really good press, and then you can attach this at the shoulder seams. Right? You can attach the facing at the shoulder seams and in the front where the V is, and that will capture it and keep it down in there. All right, so that looks great. That is our collar. That is really the hardest part of this entire garment. It is the one that has the most work, but that's, you get that beautiful collar. So that is where we're at with the collar. I'm really happy with that. So the next thing I'm going to do is do the side seams. So I'm going to put the top right sides together. Because remember, we made these arm band facings. So we're going to apply those, but first we need to sew up the side seam. So you can see there's this little kind of a notched edge. Right? This is the arm, this is the side seam. So we're going to pin that underarm, and then we're going to pin this down on the other end because we want them to be even. And because there's an angle here, you can see that this is where my seam allowance is, 3/8 of an inch. So one goes off in a little direction, and that's okay. But look at how beautiful this fits, right? So I don't have to futz with it. It's absolutely drafted perfectly. As long as you cut them correctly, it will go together beautifully. So I'm going to sew all the way down the side and around this little corner here so I can have my armhole, and then I'm going to attach my cuff. So I'm going to do that on both sides. All right, I sewed up my side seams. This is a really good time to try it on before you go ahead and serge it. It's kind of important to make sure you fit before you put some serging on it. And if you look at the hem, you know how we had those little offset edges, right? This ends up being perfect. Now I like to press my seams to the back. It's just, that's my habit. The side seams always go to the back for me, but you can see, because it's a high-low, how that comes together beautifully. All right. So now we are going to apply our sleeve cuff. So we have this sleeve opening here. We have our cuff, right, that we made. We're going to lay this on top of the sleeve. So these sleeves, let's go this way. These sleeves are symmetrical. They're at the same length front and back. So what I want to do is I want to find the center, the top center of my cuff. I'm going to fold it at the bottom where that angle is, and fold it there at the seam to find the top center. And then I'm going to lay this over. Here's my arm. All right, there's my armhole. I'm going to lay this over my armhole. Right sides together. I'm going to match up this pin that we measured at the top with my shoulder seam. And then I'm going to match up the bottom seam of the cuff with the bottom seam of my blouse. Pin that together. And then just throw a few pins all the way around. Now you can see we made these cuffs one unit, which makes it so much easier to apply it to the blouse, because if you were dealing with 2 or 3 layers of cuff and the edge of the blouse opening, it would be really annoying. So this way, it's just like plying one piece of fabric. So I'm going to stitch these on just like this, and then they just flip over and you have this beautiful cuff. So I'm going to stitch on both of my cuffs and we'll be back. So I've stitched on my arm facing. It looks great. And then pressed the seam allowance towards the garment. So it's finished, the armhole's finished. It's a really nice way to finish an armhole. And then I gave my top a good press. I'm going to need to do a few little tacking stitches down here. But I like the way the collar looks, the way the collar turned out. It's balanced and even, and it pressed really well. So I'm impressed with that. So the last thing, we're almost done. The last thing we have to do is put our hem banding on, and the method that I used is I've sewn the hem bandings together, and we're going to apply them to the bottom of our garment. It's pretty simple. Here's my top, right side up. Okay, so this is the front facing up, front of my top, and this is my hem edge. And it's a high-low, so the hem in the back is longer than the hem in the front. There's more real estate here going around, right, because it's longer. Now my top, if you think about this, the top is wider at the bottom and more narrow as it goes up, right, because it's like this. So when I look at my facing piece, there are a couple of things I need to look at. I need to look at this longer piece goes in the back because my back is longer. So the shorter piece goes in the front. But I also need to keep in mind that it's narrower, right? It's going this way. The side seams are going at an angle. So I want the widest run of the hem facing attached to my hem, so the narrowest part turns up. All right? So we're going to attach these right sides together, very similar to the way that we attached the sleeve binding. And I want the widest part, this widest part of this curve, to attach to my garment. Right? Because we're going to sew this, we're going to sew this to the hem, and then we're going to turn it inside and it's going to finish the hem. So it's a hem banding. It's a little different technique than we've used before, but it makes a beautiful hem. So I have my side seam here. This is the front of my garment. I have my side seam here. My side seams go to the back. So my facing seam is going to go to the front, and that will give me a really nice butted seam, and I don't have a lot of bulk there. So that saves me from some of the bulk. And I'm going to go to my other side seam and pin that one. And again, the garment side seam goes to the back and the facing side seam goes to the front. So I actually put a pin in both of the seam allowances. That way I keep them. You can feel them with your fingers. You can move them back and forth. And you can feel them when they've butted up against each other. So I put a pin in each one of them so I don't get, as I'm sewing, I don't get like a rimple. Now this facing, if we've sewed everything correctly, should fit the garment beautifully. So we're just going to pin the front. Lost my pin. All right. Let that pin go. There it is. Pin the front all the way around and see how we did. Now in our center front, we opened it up because we had that V up there. So I'm just going to pin down the seam allowances on the center front of the blouse so I don't get a ripple as I go through the sewing machine. And look at that, it fits perfectly. So that's the front. Now we're gonna flip it over. Hopefully we have the same luck with the back. Since we've done the side seams already, we're just going to pin it around. And it should fit perfectly. I like to put pins in this because this crepe is beautiful, it's slippery, and the pins will help me make sure that I get an even stitch all the way around the garment. Look at that, gorgeous, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and sew this, and after we sew it, right, after we sew this, it's going to flip under, and that's going to finish our seam. So we're going to stitch it, make sure that everything is copacetic. We're going to serge this edge. I'm going to serge this edge up here also, just because it's neater. I think it makes a neater looking garment. All right, I stitched my facing all the way around. It went on beautifully. And then I serged my seam and pressed my facing away from the garment, and also the facing of the facing and the seam allowance away from the garment, right? Because I'm going to understitch this again, just like we did with the collar. Understitching is the best way to get a super clean roll on the edge. So it's going to give us a beautiful edge on our garment. And then the last thing we need to do is stitch this down. So it's a top stitching technique, so you actually see the stitching. And you're going to determine, this is, looks like about 3.5 inches. So you're going to determine how high you're going to do this stitching. You can actually, if your machine is balanced, you can stitch it from the underside. It's not a problem. And then you can see where you're stitching, and you see where you're stitching, finishing this stitching edge. But do the understitching first, because then you get this beautiful crisp edge. Understitch, press, pin, and then you can top stitch this hem down. And then our garment's all done. Woohoo! All right, so I stitched my facing on. I understitched the facing to the seam allowance. Okay. You can see that I stitched the facing to the seam allowance, which gives me this opportunity to get this beautiful roll. So it rolls all of the seam to the back. And then I took my Rowenta and I steamed the heck out of it. So I have this beautiful hem edge from the front. It looks absolutely gorgeous, right? That's so pretty. So I'm going to stitch it from the wrong side because that gives me a better gauge. I can see where my hem is. I'm just going to pop this in my machine. And then determine where my stitch is going to be. So I can see here, down here on my gauge, that I'm like at 11, whatever that means on my gauge. But you can put a piece of tape here on your machine, but you want this spacing to be even all the way around because you're going to see that from the other side. So you have to determine whatever that spacing is going to be. Mine's probably a little narrower than yours because I actually serged the raw edge of my facing, but I want my stitching to be up near the edge. If it's too far down here and you have all this extra fabric flopping around, gravity is going to pull that down. It's not a good look, so we don't want that. So we're going to start at a side seam, make sure we have the same measurement going all the way around, and stitch our hem facing. Then we're all done. We just need to press, do a little bit of hand stitching on the facing for the collar, and wear it. I'm excited.